New unconfirmed reports claim American and Dutch F-16 pilots are flying combat missions over Ukraine to take down Russian cruise missile and drone attacks. So what would that mean if it were true, and should we believe it? Let's run down why we shouldn't consider these reports gospel, but why I wouldn't be surprised if they were true. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is a pretty bite-sized edition of Air Power.
Box one.
According to this new report, a mixed squadron of F-16 pilots was stood up by the Ukrainian Air Force in recent weeks that's made up of Ukrainian pilots as well as veterans of both the American and Dutch Air Forces who are no longer on active duty and are now signing 6-month contracts with Ukraine to fight as contractors, in much the same way volunteers from nations around the world have volunteered to fight with Ukrainian infantry on the ground. So let's start with the claim. The story originated on Sunday with a report from a fairly reputable French outlet called Intelligence Online, and was then quickly picked up by Ukrainian media outlets before being discussed somewhat skeptically by some Western news outlets like the Aviationist, though none of this coverage so far has identified a verifiable source for the claim. So, for now at least, this is entirely hearsay. But is it credible and realistic hearsay, or is it hyperbole being laundered through a long chain of citation links? Well, I honestly can't say for sure, but what I can say is that the claim, at least on its face, seems entirely feasible to me. According to this new report, this new mixed squadron is primarily tasked with flying nighttime patrols over the Kyiv Oblast, where they swat down inbound Caliber and Kh-101 cruise missiles, as well as one-way kamikaze drones, like Russia's Garin 2. And that is a very big job. According to Ukrainian military intelligence reports, Russia's ramped-up military industry is currently producing around 195 total cruise and ballistic missiles per month, including ship-launched cruise missiles like the Caliber and air-launched weapons like their Kh-101. Now, Caliber can be thought of sort of like the Russian version of the American Tomahawk, as it's usually launched from ships. It can carry up to an 1,100-pound warhead, and depending on version, can reach targets as far out as 1,550 miles, or about 2,500 kilometers out. The Kh-101, on the other hand, is an air-launched cruise missile that's usually deployed from Russian bombers, like the Tu-160 and Tu-95MS, which usually launch them from outside Ukrainian airspace to, avoid being shot down themselves. These weapons can carry up to 880 pounds of explosives on board and cover a claimed 2,174 miles, about 3,500 kilometers to reach their targets. But the bigger threat just might be those cheap little Garin 2s, which may only be able to deliver around 110 pounds to targets 1,600 miles, or about 2,500 kilometers away, but they're way cheaper and easier to build. In fact, Russia is believed to be building anywhere from 170 to 190 of these weapons per day. The reports say the American fighter pilots working for Ukraine, however many there may be, all have direct combat experience over the Middle East, and both American and Dutch pilots are a lot more familiar with using systems like Lockheed Martin's Sniper Advanced Targeting Pod, which has been provided to Ukraine and can help to identify targets at long distances, including slow-moving kamikaze drones that pilots can then engage with weapons like the low-cost AGR-20. Also known as the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2, which is something of a mini-missile meant to bring down low-cost targets like drones. A single Ukrainian F-16 can carry 42 AGR-20s, along with 4 additional standard air-to-air missiles and 2 external fuel tanks to extend your range or your loiter time. And this all makes all sorts of sense. Ukraine's been promised 85 F-16 so far, and it's believed at least 30 have arrived in the country by now, with 4 seemingly lost so far to combat and friendly fire. It isn't clear how many trained Viper pilots Ukraine's got, but even those they have all went through an abbreviated training course just meant to make them proficient enough to fight. But they are anything but experts in this platform. By hiring foreign pilots who are no longer on active duty, Ukraine could get a ton of cockpit experience into the fight right away, without sacrificing pilot numbers to get their homegrown aviators into that F-16 training pipeline. Then, once they're trained, they can come back and fight alongside seasoned American, Dutch, and now also Ukrainian pilots as they continue to develop and hone their skills at the stick. Heck, Senator Lindsey Graham actually proposed doing exactly this when he visited Ukraine in 2024. So, if these reports are true, it should be noted that American F-16 pilots would need approval from the Pentagon to go fly for Ukraine legally, even if they're not in service anymore. But as we've seen with some pilots flying off to help China in exchange for a payday, there are certainly ways around doing so. In any case, these pilots would not be flying as members of the U.S. Armed Forces on loan to Ukraine, and instead should be considered more like independent contractors, or even mercenaries, if you don't mind the term. And if they get shot down in that case, well, Uncle Sam would all but certainly not step in to help. And in some regards, that sort of makes what they're doing all the more heroic, assuming, of course, there's any truth to this story at all.